Brian lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling back to the details that refused to give him peace. Her phone was always by her side, her face always slightly turned away from him. A random call at 2 a.m. that she quickly declined, explaining it as a work mistake. The perfume he'd never smelled on her before when she came home late one evening. But the worst was the previous night. When she said she was going to see a friend, he decided to check. He followed her to a small restaurant on the edge of town, where she met a man. Their conversation seemed tense, but what stood out was when she placed her hand on his. Even though it lasted just a moment, it was enough to turn his suspicions into near certainty. He needed to hear the truth. Caught in a web of lies. How I exposed my wife's double life. When Brian Stewart married Melanie, he was convinced he had found the woman of his dreams. Together, they built a home that seemed like a perfect reflection of their happiness. Melanie was charming, caring, and always knew how to make every day special. But one day, Brian began noticing little things that unsettled him. At first, it was minor details, missed calls, late nights at work, a new dress he'd never seen before. One evening, when Melanie came home later than usual, her phone accidentally rang. Brian saw the name David on the screen. "That's my coworker," Melanie explained with a smile. "We've been working on an important project." But there was something in her eyes that made Brian doubt her words. Over the following weeks, Brian began noticing more inconsistencies. Melanie grew distant, her smile seemed forced, and her eyes betrayed tension. One day, when she went to take a shower, Brian decided to check her phone. What he found hit him like a bolt of lightning. A message from David. "Thank you for an unforgettable night. I can't wait to see you again." Brian's heart sank. It felt like the ground was giving way beneath him. But instead of confronting Melanie immediately, he decided to act strategically. He took screenshots of the messages and saved them. He wanted to uncover the full truth. Brian started keeping an eye on Melanie. He noticed she began spending more time at work and frequently disappeared without explanations. One evening, when she said she was going to visit a friend, Brian decided to follow her. He watched as she got into David's car. They drove to an upscale restaurant, where a table adorned with flowers and candles awaited them. Brian knew it was time to act. He decided to take photos and videos to collect undeniable proof of her betrayal. But instead of confronting her immediately, he decided to wait. He wanted to see just how far Melanie had gone. Brian sat in the dark kitchen, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. On the screen were the screenshots of Melanie and David's messages. The feeling of betrayal burned inside him, but he resolved to keep his composure. He knew the upcoming conversation would be the hardest of his life. When Melanie walked into the kitchen, she looked tired yet strangely calm. She had no idea what awaited her. "We need to talk," Brian said, his voice steady but laced with tension. Melanie froze, looking at him. "Did something happen?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Brian placed his phone on the table, turning the screen toward her. It displayed the message from David. Melanie's face changed before his eyes. It turned pale, then flushed red. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "What is this?" Brian asked coldly, his eyes fixed on hers. "Explain to me what this means." Melanie picked up the phone, as if trying to buy herself time. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she tried to maintain her composure. "It's not what you think," she began, but Brian cut her off. "Not what I think," he raised his voice. "You call this work? Romantic dinners? Unforgettable nights? How long has this been going on, Melanie?" She lowered her head but stayed silent. Brian could feel his anger mixing with despair. "Speak," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Melanie suddenly looked up. Her eyes burned with anger. "And you think you're perfect?" she yelled back. "Do you even notice what's been happening in our life? You're always so busy with work, and I just wanted to feel alive." Those words hit Brian harder than any physical blow. He couldn't believe she was trying to justify her betrayal by pointing out his shortcomings. "So that's your excuse for cheating on me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Melanie stood up, her face streaked with tears. "It was a mistake," she said, "but you're not blameless. You were never there when I needed you. You didn't even notice how distant I was becoming. Brian sat silently, trying to process her words. Could he really have been so blind? But he knew one thing. Her lies could never be justified. Slowly, he stood up and looked at Melanie. "You've destroyed our life," he said, his voice icy cold. "And now, I don't know if I can forgive you." Melanie started to say something, but Brian raised his hand, silencing her. "I want to know everything. Every detail. Otherwise, our marriage ends right here, right now." Melanie nodded, trying to calm herself. She knew she had lost control of the situation, but had one last chance to explain. Her voice trembled. "It started a few months ago." Brian didn't sleep all night. His thoughts raced between anger, despair, and the desire to understand. Morning came quietly, but the tension in the air was palpable. He knew that today he would learn the truth, no matter how painful it was. Melanie sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded on her knees. Her face looked exhausted. Brian walked into the living room and sat down across from her, his eyes never leaving her. "Start," he said curtly. Melanie took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "It started accidentally. David. He was so attentive, so different from you lately. I know that's no excuse, but I felt lonely." Brian clenched his fists, trying not to explode. "Lonely? We live together. Sleep in the same bed. How could you?" "You don't understand." Melanie looked him in the eye for the first time. "You were always busy. Work, plans, distant projects. And I just wanted to be noticed." "So, you went to him?" His voice was sharp, almost icy. "How long did it last?" "A few months," she admitted, lowering her head. "But it's over now. I ended it." Brian glanced at the phone again, where the messages still lingered. "Ended it? Then what's this?" He showed her the latest message from David. Melanie covered her face with her hands. She started crying. "I tried. I really tried to break it off. But what?" Brian interrupted her. "What else haven't you told me?" Melanie paused for a long time, trying to gather her thoughts. Finally, she said, "I'm pregnant." The words hit like a thunderclap. Brian froze, unsure what to say. A deafening silence filled the room. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples. "What did you just say?" His voice was barely audible. I'm pregnant," she repeated, and tears once again streamed down her cheeks. "But I'm not sure if it's your child." Brian rose from his seat, feeling his anger boil over. "You're not sure? Are you serious?" He began pacing the room. "How could you let this happen?" Melanie tried to approach him, but he stepped back. "Please, let me explain," she begged. "It was a mistake, I know, but I want us to try to fix this." "Fix this?" His laugh was bitter. "You've destroyed everything we've built over the years. And now you're saying you want to fix it? How do you even imagine that?" Melanie didn't know what to say. She just stood there, her head bowed. Brian, exhausted and shattered, finally said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I need to know the full truth. Whose child is this? And what are you planning to do next?" Melanie remained silent, then quietly said, "I want to keep the baby, no matter whose it is. But I want you to stay with me, Brian. I'll do everything to make you trust me again." His eyes were filled with pain. "It's not that simple. We can't go back to how things were. But maybe we can find a way." Brian sat in his car, parked outside the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. He didn't know if he had the strength to go inside and take the first step toward answering the question that haunted him. Am I the father of this child? The thought echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. When the hospital doors opened, Brian felt his heart clench. He picked up his phone and reread the message he had sent Melanie that morning. "I'll make the appointment for the test. It's for both of us. We need to know the truth." Her response had been brief. "All right, I'm ready." But was she ready? Was he? Melanie was waiting in the reception area, looking surprisingly calm. Her face was impeccably made up, and she even tried to smile. But there was something in her eyes that Brian couldn't identify, fear, or maybe guilt. "Hi," he said dryly, sitting down next to her. "Hi," she replied, without looking up. The silence between them was heavy. A doctor came out and invited them into the office. Brian never took his eyes off Melanie as the doctor explained the procedure. She only nodded, but her hands were clenched into fists, something Brian didn't fail to notice. When the samples were collected, Brian heard the doctor say, "The results will be ready in 3 days. We'll contact you." Melanie nodded and quickly left the office. Brian caught up with her in the hallway. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked. "I just want this to be over," she replied. "It's exhausting." She stepped outside and lit a cigarette, despite having promised to quit long ago. Brian stood nearby, watching her. He couldn't understand why she looked so tense. "What are you hiding, Melanie?" he finally asked. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Nothing. I'm just scared, Brian. I'm afraid you'll leave me." "That depends on what the test shows," he said coldly. The next 3 days were tense. Brian noticed that Melanie became even more nervous. She tried to avoid him, though they still lived under the same roof. Her phone was always with her, and she had even changed her password. When the day to receive the results arrived, Brian felt the oppressive weight again. They met at the hospital, and the doctor invited them into his office. Sitting behind his desk, he opened the folder and said, "Well, the results are in." Melanie, sitting next to Brian, tightly gripped his hand. She was trembling. The doctor looked at them, paused, and said, "Brian, you are not the biological father of this child." The words exploded in the room like a bomb. Melanie abruptly let go of Brian's hand and covered her face with her hands. Brian sat motionless, his face expressionless. "You knew, didn't you?" he finally said, his voice full of coldness and bitterness. Melanie didn't answer. Her silence was an answer in itself. Brian stood, casting a look of disdain at her. "You knew all along, and yet you still played me?" She lifted her head, her face wet with tears. I was just afraid you'd leave me. I thought I could convince you to stay." "Convince me?" Brian laughed bitterly. "You decided to play this disgusting game, knowing the truth? Now I'm certain I've made the right choice." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Melanie alone with her shattered illusions. Brian stood on the doorstep of their house, his suitcases by his side. He cast one last glance at Melanie, who stood in the hallway. Her eyes were red from crying, but she didn't give up. "This is the end, Melanie. I can't do this anymore." His voice was filled with pain, but he remained composed. "You're just going to leave?" Her voice was sharp, almost hysterical. "After everything we've been through together?" "Brian, think. I know I made a mistake, but I'm ready to fix it." "This isn't a mistake, Melanie," he replied, his voice turning cold. "This is betrayal, and I can't live with what you've done, especially now, knowing you even lied about the child." Melanie suddenly ran up to him, grabbing his arm. "If you leave, I'll tell everyone. Your friends, your family, your colleagues. I'll tell them you drove me to this, that you were a cruel, indifferent husband who ignored me." Her voice carried a warning, her eyes shining with anger. Brian froze. His heart raced, not with fear but with fury. "You want to blackmail me? After everything you've done?" His voice was low, each word carrying the weight of a verdict. "I don't want you to leave." She screamed, her voice cracking. "I love you, Brian. I made a mistake, but I'll fight for us." He pulled his arm free and stepped back. "This isn't love, Melanie. This is manipulation. You've already destroyed our life, but you won't ruin my future." She began crying again, but this time her tears didn't evoke his sympathy. "You think you can just leave?" Her voice softened but carried more menace. "I have messages. I have photos. I'll make your life unbearable if you leave me." Brian closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His thoughts were chaotic, but he knew he had to stay calm. "Do whatever you want, Melanie," he said, opening the door. "But remember, the truth always comes out, and you'll be left alone with all your mess." He walked out of the house, leaving her in the empty hallway. She fell to her knees, her scream echoing in the silence. Brian's phone rang at 7 a.m. as he was preparing for an important client meeting. The number was unfamiliar, but something inside urged him to answer. "Mr. Stewart? This is Sarah from PR. We need to speak urgently," said a woman on the other end, her voice tense. "What happened?" he asked, his heart beginning to race. "It's Rumors about you have started spreading, and they've already reached journalists. Can you come to the office as soon as possible? Brian hung up the phone and hastily began getting ready. On his way to the office, he opened his social media accounts. Everything became clear immediately. His name was in the headlines, next to compromising photos that Melanie had obviously leaked. The articles were worse than he could have imagined. Prominent businessman Brian Stewart, a tyrant in family life? Shocking details from his wife. Everything Melanie had said to him was now being used against him. Accusations of neglecting her feelings, belittling her, and creating unbearable living conditions. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. The photos she published included him with a random colleague, just a friendly lunch, but now it looked like an affair. The atmosphere at the office was tense. His colleagues avoided eye contact, and Sarah, who met him in the conference room, looked as though she was on the verge of tears. Brian, this is serious. If we don't fix this immediately, we could lose some key clients, she said, pointing to a laptop displaying the articles. Brian remained silent. He didn't know how to respond. Finally, he sighed and said, I know who did this, and I'm going to deal with it. At home, Melanie was waiting for him. She sat on the couch, looking far too calm. So, how was your day, darling? She asked with an ironic smile. Brian felt his anger rising. This is your doing, he said, throwing printed copies of the articles onto the table. You leaked this to the press, didn't you? Melanie's smile grew even wider. Did you really think you could leave me just like that? Without consequences? Oh, Brian, you underestimated me. You're not just destroying me. You're ruining yourself too, he said, trying to contain himself. Do you understand that these articles hurt not only my reputation but also our shared life? I lost everything I had when you decided to leave, she replied. Now I'm just taking back what's mine. And what do you want? He asked coldly. Money? The house? What? Melanie leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a sinister spark. I want you to stay. I want you to realize that without me, your life is empty, and I'll do whatever it takes to make you see that. Brian realized there was no negotiating. He stood up, turning toward the door. You've already lost, Melanie. I'll find a way to stop you. Brian sat in his office, staring at the blank computer monitor. His thoughts swung between anger and despair. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A message from Melanie. You have 24 hours to change your mind. Otherwise, your partners will see everything. Attached to the message were several photos. They had been taken a long time ago, during a company party. Nothing truly incriminating. But in the context Melanie could create, they looked very suspicious, especially considering how she had recently twisted his friendly lunch with a colleague. Brian went home, where Melanie was already waiting for him. She sat at the table with her laptop, her face radiating smug satisfaction. So, have you thought it over? She asked without even looking up. What do you want this time? His voice was restrained but tense. Melanie stepped into the hallway and returned with a folder in her hands. She opened it and began spreading photographs across the table. Each one depicted something that could be misinterpreted as compromising. This isn't all, she said, picking up one of the photos. There's also a video, and I'm ready to release it if you don't agree to my terms. What are your terms? Brian asked sharply, his patience wearing thin. You stay with me. We continue to look like the perfect couple, and you stop thinking about divorce. Brian began laughing, but his laugh was bitter rather than humorous. Do you seriously think I'd agree to that? After all of this? Melanie lifted her head, her expression turning cold. You have no choice, Brian. If you leave, I'll destroy you. Literally. Brian knew he had to act. He contacted his lawyer and a private investigator, hoping to find a way to protect himself. The investigator promised to uncover whether Melanie had anything else she was hiding. At the same time, Brian began watching her actions. He suspected she wasn't working alone. His suspicions were confirmed when he noticed her meeting with David. They talked at a cafe, and then Melanie handed him a flash drive. Brian took several photos of the meeting. Now, at least, he had something that could give him an advantage. The next morning, Melanie greeted him again with her usual sarcastic tone. So, are you ready to accept my terms? Brian took out his phone and showed her the photos with David. Her smile vanished. Now we play by my rules, he said, feeling his confidence return. And if you take one more step to destroy me, I won't stop until I destroy you. Melanie stared at him in fear but said nothing. Brian realized that she was afraid now, and that gave him a chance. Brian woke up in the middle of the night to the vibration of his phone. The screen lit up with a message that instantly jolted him awake. Check the news. This is just the beginning. He opened his browser and saw a video that had already gone viral. His name was in every headline. The footage showed Brian supposedly threatening Melanie during one of their recent arguments. The video was edited in such a way that he looked like the aggressor, while her cries for help added drama to the scene. Brian felt his heart racing. It was clearly doctored, but at first glance, it looked very convincing. The phone rang again. This time, it was his lawyer. "Brian, we're in trouble," the lawyer said without any greeting. "That video, it's already on the desks of several clients. If we don't act immediately, your reputation will be destroyed." "I know who did it," Brian replied, his voice trembling with fury. "It's Melanie. She threatened me with this." "We need evidence," the lawyer said. "Without it, we can't prove it's fake. You need to act quickly." The next morning, Brian arrived at the house that had once been their shared home. Melanie was waiting for him, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand. Her smile was smug. "Did you really think you could outplay me?" she said, not even getting up. "You've crossed the line, Melanie," Brian replied, clenching his fists. "This isn't a game anymore. You've destroyed me in the eyes of my clients, my colleagues. What's next?" Melanie raised her glass as if making a toast. "Next? Next, you'll do exactly what I say. Otherwise, I'll release the rest. And there's a lot more where that came from. Do you think I'll just let this go?" His voice was cold. "I have my own cards to play, and I'll use them." Melanie shrugged. "Use them if you can. But Brian, you've forgotten who I am. I'm always one step ahead." Brian returned to his car, feeling both empty and determined. He called his detective, explaining the latest developments. "We need to find the original video," he said, "and figure out how she got these recordings." The detective agreed. A few hours later, he called back with news. "I found a lead." The video was uploaded from an account linked to David. Brian felt his blood boil. Once again, David was at the center of this story. He decided it was time to act. That evening, Brian met David at a bar. David appeared calm, even a little smug. "Did you really think you could walk away from this without consequences?" David asked as Brian sat down next to him. "Melanie warned you, but you didn't listen." "You made a mistake trusting her," Brian replied. "I have everything I need to destroy you. Your schemes, your dealings. And if you don't stop, I'll use it." David leaned in closer, his smile fading. "Then you'd better make sure your hit is the last one. Because if it's not, you have no idea what's coming your way." Brian had never felt so vulnerable. He thought he knew what Melanie was capable of, but this time, the situation was spiraling out of control. Her latest actions had only partially sunk in, but now David's involvement made it an explosive combination. From early that morning, Brian noticed his phone was practically blowing up with messages. The first call came from his longtime friend, James. "Have you seen this?" James asked without any greeting. "Seen what?" Brian replied, trying to stay calm. "Check your email. Everyone's talking about it." Brian opened his laptop and checked his inbox. A new email with the subject line, "Is this what you've been hiding?" Inside were photos showing him with a woman who had absolutely no connection to him. In some shots, they appeared too close for it to be a coincidence. The problem was, all these photos were fabricated. Brian felt his stomach drop. The email ended with a note. "Unpleasant rumors about you are spreading, and they've already reached journalists. Can you come to the office as soon as possible?" Brian knew this was the work of David and Melanie. He recognized their style. These people would stop at nothing to destroy his life. To confirm his suspicions, he decided to confront them directly. That evening, he found them both at a bar, sitting together at a table, clearly discussing something important. Brian walked in, making his presence known. David raised his glass toward him. "Finally," David said, "we've been waiting for you." Melanie just smiled. It was that same smile Brian hated more than anything else. "What are you plotting this time?" Brian asked, sitting down next to them. David leaned forward. We just want you to understand. Resisting us is pointless. We can destroy not only your career but your personal life as well. From now on, Melanie added, you'll play by our rules. Otherwise, she gestured toward her phone. Next time, this will be seen by your children, your family, everyone you're trying to protect. Brian felt his anger boiling, but he knew he couldn't afford to be reckless. He stood up, casting a cold glance at both of them. You've both made a big mistake, he said, and I will find a way to stop you. At home, he spent hours at his laptop, combing through old messages, photos, and records. He needed to find at least one weak link in their plan. And he did. One of the contacts Melanie had been messaging worked for David's company. This person could be their accomplice. Brian decided to meet him. The next day, he went to David's office and found the man, a young analyst named Ryan. At first, Ryan denied everything, but when Brian began showing him evidence of their connection, he cracked. They paid me to help with data fabrication, Ryan admitted, lowering his head. But I didn't think it would go this far. And now you'll help me, Brian replied. Otherwise, I'll make sure your involvement is exposed to everyone. Ryan agreed, and within a few hours, Brian had the evidence he needed to turn the situation in his favor. Brian sat at his desk, his heart pounding with adrenaline. On the screen was a prepared post. All the evidence he had gathered against Melanie and David. Messages, phone call recordings, financial documents. He knew it was a risky move, but he had no other choice. He clicked publish and watched as his post began spreading across social media. The reaction was immediate. Comments, shares, calls. People began discussing how Melanie and David had abused his trust, falsified evidence, and conspired against him. It seemed like the truth was finally coming to light. But Brian didn't know that this move would trigger a chain reaction he couldn't stop. That evening, Brian's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His lawyer, friends, colleagues, everyone wanted to know what was going on. But the most significant call he received was from Melanie. Do you really think you've won? Her voice was steely. You have no idea what you've just done. I did what I had to do, Brian replied. Now everyone knows who you really are. She laughed, and the sound sent a chill down his spine. This is just the beginning, Brian. You wanted a war? You'll get one. The next day, the news exploded with new information. Melanie and David held a press conference where they presented their version of events. They accused Brian of fabricating evidence, claiming that all the data he published was fake, created to avoid accountability for his abusive behavior toward Melanie. I've always loved Brian, Melanie said tearfully in front of the cameras, her eyes glistening. But he broke me. I tried to save our marriage, and now he's trying to destroy me. David, standing beside her, added, It's unfortunate, but we have to defend ourselves. We're suing Brian for defamation and emotional distress. Brian watched the broadcast, feeling his rage grow. They weren't just denying the truth, they were turning it on its head. His phone lit up with more calls, but this time they were from clients canceling contracts, citing reputational risks. He realized that Melanie and David weren't going to stop. They had launched a full-scale offensive, and now his life had become a battlefield. But he wasn't about to give up. Brian decided he needed help. He met with his lawyer and detective to plan his next move. We need to find a weak spot in their defense, he said. Something that will expose their lies once and for all. The detective nodded. There's one lead we can pursue. I found records of David's financial transactions that look suspicious. If we can prove he used money to bribe witnesses, it could change the game. Do it, Brian said. We don't have time. Brian sat in a dark room, hunched over the documents the detective had just handed him. On paper were all the necessary pieces of evidence. Transactions proving how David had used accounts for money laundering and bribing witnesses. This material could destroy David. But Brian also knew it would mark the beginning of an even more dangerous game. That evening, Brian decided to act. He met with his lawyer, who advised him to leave the matter to law enforcement. This isn't just about financial misconduct, the lawyer said. There are some very serious people involved here, Brian. If you take this step, you're plunging yourself into a real war. I don't have a choice, Brian replied. They've already crossed every line. I can't just sit back and watch as they destroy my life. The lawyer sighed heavily. Fine, but be prepared for the consequences. Brian decided it was time to share part of the evidence with journalists. He knew David wouldn't be able to respond immediately if the information went public. But what happened next exceeded all his expectations. The next morning, Brian woke up to a message. It was a photo of his house taken at night. Alongside the photo was a text, "You don't know who you're dealing with." Brian realized that David knew who was behind the publication. His heart sank. This was a clear signal that David was willing to do anything. A few hours later, Brian noticed that his car had been vandalized, windows smashed, tires slashed. It was another warning. He understood it was time to act cautiously. He arranged a meeting with David, hoping for some sort of compromise. But David only smirked. "Did you really think this would be so simple?" David said. "Have you forgotten who I am? I play on levels you can't even imagine." "But you make mistakes too," Brian replied. "And this game could end very badly for you." "We'll see about that," David said, standing and leaving the room. Later that evening, Brian received another message. It contained a video of him during a conversation with his lawyer, discussing the evidence against David. The video had clearly been edited to make it look as though Brian himself was involved in the schemes. The message was clear: publish or not, it's up to you. Brian realized that David was preparing for a massive attack. He decided to make one final move: hand over all his evidence to law enforcement. But to do so, he needed to ensure his safety. He called the detective. "I need your help," he said. "I want this to end." The detective agreed. They planned to meet in a secure location, but at the last moment, Brian received news that changed everything. Brian returned home late that evening, exhausted from endless discussions with his lawyer and detective. The lights in his apartment were off, and the silence felt suspicious. He entered the living room, and his eyes immediately fell on an envelope lying on the table. Written on it was a single word: urgent. Tearing open the envelope, he found a note. The handwriting was familiar. It was Melanie's. "Brian, I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but I'm not writing to justify myself. David is planning something that will put your life at risk. He believes you've gone too far and can no longer be allowed to interfere. Stay safe. M." Brian felt his heart race. Was this another manipulation? But if not, it meant his life was in real danger. He sat down, trying to collect his thoughts. Who could he trust? The detective? The lawyer? Or was this a trap, and Melanie was acting in David's interests? The phone rang, making him flinch. The detective's number appeared on the screen. "Brian, we've uncovered something interesting," the detective said. "One of David's contacts ordered surveillance of your movements. It seems they've been watching you for weeks." "This confirms Melanie might not be lying," Brian replied, feeling a tightness in his chest. "I suggest we meet at a secure location," the detective said. "We need to proceed cautiously." On his way to the agreed location, Brian noticed he was being followed. In the rearview mirror, he saw a black sedan that had been tailing him for over 10 minutes. He turned onto another road, but the car continued to follow. Suddenly, his phone rang again. It was an unknown number. "You can't run, Brian," said the voice on the other end. It was David. "We're already close." Brian abruptly turned into a narrow alley and switched off his headlights. He held his breath as the black sedan drove past. His hands were shaking, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Reaching the designated location, Brian met the detective. The man looked tense but composed. "We need to learn more about David's plan," the detective said. "We have one chance: infiltrate his office and find the evidence. I know it's dangerous, but there's no other way." "This is insane," Brian said, but he knew the detective was right. That night, they headed to David's office. The detective used his connections to gain access to the building. Inside, it was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. They reached David's office and began searching for documents. "This is it," the detective whispered, pulling a flash drive from the safe. "It's all here. His schemes, his plans to target you." But before they could leave, the office door swung open. Standing in the doorway was David, flanked by several security guards. "You think you're smarter than me?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Brian and the detective froze. They were trapped. As Brian and the detective found themselves cornered, a tense silence filled David's office. David stood there with a cold smile, exuding confidence in his victory. His guards blocked all exits, and Brian felt his chest tighten. "You think you can play games with me?" David said, staring directly at Brian. "I warned you, but you didn't listen. Now you'll pay." Suddenly, noise echoed from the hallway. Loud voices and hurried footsteps approached the office. Moments later, the door burst open, and Melanie walked in. Her face was tense, her eyes blazing. "Stop this, David," she said, stepping between him and Brian. "This has gone too far." David looked surprised but quickly regained his composure. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly. "This is none of your business." "I can't let you do this," she replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "If you go through with this, you'll lose everything." David sighed and began pacing the room like a predator in a cage. "You've always been weak, Melanie," he said. "You think you're saving him? After everything he's done to you? After everything he's done to us?" "This isn't about him," she answered. "It's about not becoming like you." Brian watched her in silence, unable to understand why she had decided to intervene. Her words sounded sincere, but he knew Melanie always had her hidden motives. Could she really have changed? "This is all an act," David said, waving a hand dismissively. "She just wants to look like a hero, but it won't work. Take them." The guard stepped forward, but Melanie raised her phone, holding it up to show the screen. "If you lay a hand on us," she said, "this video of your financial schemes will hit the internet immediately." David stopped, his face twisting in anger. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," she replied, looking confident for the first time. David gestured for the guards to stand down and turned to Melanie. "Fine," he said. "You've won this round. But don't think this is over." Melanie turned to Brian and the detective. "Leave while you still can. We'll see each other again." Brian couldn't believe what was happening. He and the detective left the office, leaving Melanie alone with David. Her final words still echoed in his mind. Back home, Brian was filled with doubt. He couldn't understand why Melanie had decided to step in. Her actions had saved him in David's office, but they also raised even more questions. Could she truly have changed? Or did she have a plan of her own? The next morning, Brian received an unexpected call from Melanie. Her voice was calm, even a bit cold. "We need to talk," she said. "I know you think I did this for you, but you're wrong." Brian agreed to meet. They chose a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. When he arrived, Melanie was already waiting at a table, intently watching the entrance. Her demeanor was reserved, but there was a fire in her eyes. "I knew you'd come," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What do you want?" Brian asked, not taking a seat. "Sit down," she replied sharply. "I'll explain everything, but you need to listen to me." Brian sat down, maintaining his composure. Melanie leaned in closer. "David is a monster," she began. "But you need to understand, I didn't save you. All of this is part of my plan." "Your plan?" Brian asked, surprised. "What are you plotting?" Melanie gave a small smile. "I have enough evidence to destroy David, his financial schemes, his conspiracies. But if I just hand it over to the police, he'll find a way to avoid punishment. So, I decided to do it differently." "And what does that mean?" he asked, tensing up. "I'll use this evidence to destroy not just him, but you too," she said coldly. "Do you think I'll let you walk away from all of this unscathed?" Brian froze, his heart racing. "Why are you doing this, Melanie?" he asked. "I thought you wanted to end this mess." "I want justice," she replied. "David used me to destroy you. And you? You ignored me when I needed you most. Now, I'm taking matters into my own hands. And you think this will fix things?" His voice grew sharper. "You're just going to destroy whatever's left." "Maybe," she said, standing up, "but I refuse to be a victim anymore." Before leaving, Melanie placed a flash drive on the table. "This has everything you need to destroy David," she said. "But if you try to use it against me, I'll be ready." Brian remained seated, staring at the flash drive. He didn't know if this was a trap or a genuine chance to end the chaos. But one thing was clear. The game had just begun. Brian sat in his office, staring at the flash drive Melanie had left. His thoughts swung between anger and doubt. If what she said was true, this could be the key to taking David down once and for all. But could he trust her? And what would be the cost of this alliance? He couldn't wait long. The next morning, Brian decided to meet Melanie to get answers. They arranged to meet at her old apartment, a place that had once been their haven but had now turned into a battlefield. When Brian entered the room, Melanie was sitting by the window, holding a cup of coffee. She looked calm, but her eyes betrayed tension. "You came," she said, not taking her eyes off the street. "I didn't have a choice," Brian replied, sitting across from her. "If we want to end this chaos, we need to act together." Melanie smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Together? Are you serious? After everything that's happened between us? We both know David is the real problem," he said. "If we don't stop him, he'll destroy us both." She paused, thinking for a moment, and then said, "Maybe you're right. But if we do this, you have to agree to one condition." "What do you want?" Brian asked, feeling the tension rise. Melanie leaned in closer, her voice quieter. "I want you to stay with me after this is over. We'll start over." Those words hit him harder than any threat. "You're joking, right?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "No," she replied calmly. "That's my condition. If you want my help to destroy David, you'll come back to me. No questions, no doubts." Brian felt his chest tighten. Could he trust a woman who had betrayed him so many times? Had she really changed? Or was this just another manipulation? Otherwise, Melanie continued, "I could just hand this evidence over to David. Trust me, he'll know how to use it." Brian stayed silent, trying to gather his thoughts. He realized he didn't have a choice. But could he accept her terms? "Fine," he finally said. "But if I see that you're trying to trick me, it will be your last mistake." Melanie smiled. "Don't worry, Brian. We're on the same side now." Brian and Melanie worked on their plan for several days. They mapped out every detail, every step to trap David. Their plan was to hand over the flash drive with falsified evidence to one of David's competitors, provoking him into making a reckless move. But even the best-laid plans can crumble in an instant. Late at night, they met at a small cafe near David's office. Brian was reviewing the flash drive one last time, ensuring it contained enough compromising material to draw attention. Melanie was focused but tense. Her hands trembled as she held her phone. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Brian asked, looking directly into her eyes. "We have no other choice," she replied. "David won't stop until he destroys us both." They arranged a meeting with David's competitor in a quiet place on the outskirts of the city. But when they arrived, nothing went as planned. As soon as Brian handed the flash drive to the person representing the competitor, the door to the room suddenly burst open. David entered with a group of security guards. His face was calm, but rage burned in his eyes. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" he said, looking at them with disdain. Melanie froze, and Brian felt his chest tighten. "What are you doing here, David?" he asked, trying to buy time. "What I always do," David replied, controlling the situation. "You both made a huge mistake." He tossed the flash drive onto the table. "Did you think I wouldn't check its contents? It's a cheap trick. But the real question is, what will you say when I reveal your own secrets?" David gestured to one of the guards to turn on a laptop. The screen displayed recordings of conversations between Melanie and Brian, as well as videos of them discussing the evidence and their plan to take David down. "This is just a fraction of what I have," he said. "If this gets to the media, your lives are over. And not just your careers." Melanie tried to collect herself. "You wouldn't dare," she said. "If you do, you'll go down with us." "Maybe," David replied with a smile. "But I'm willing to take that risk." "Are you?" Brian realized the situation had spiraled out of control. He needed to find a way to turn the tables. "What do you want, David?" he asked. David stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. "I want your complete surrender. You leave the city. Get out of my life forever." Melanie looked at Brian, her eyes full of fear. She realized that David had the upper hand. But could she trust Brian to find a way out together? Brian and Melanie sat in the dark room, their thoughts consumed by fear and tension. After the meeting with David, everything had changed. He held their lives in his hands, and his new proposal threatened to ruin everything. David entered the room, his movements confident. He sat at the table, placing the laptop in front of him. "So, you've found yourselves in a difficult situation," he began, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "But I'm offering you a way out. Simple and straightforward. What do you want?" Brian asked, trying to remain calm. David looked at Melanie, his smile widening. "This concerns you, Melanie. I want you to make a choice." "What choice?" Her voice trembled. "Betray him," David said, leaning forward. "Give me all his plans, all his weaknesses. Help me destroy him once and for all. And I promise, you'll come out of this clean." Melanie froze. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Brian, who silently waited for her response. He said nothing, but his gaze was full of pain and distrust. "Do you really think I'll do that?" She finally replied, looking at David. "I think you're a smart woman," he said. "And you know this is the only way to save yourself." Brian couldn't hold back. "Don't listen to him, Melanie. He's manipulating you. We can find another way." But her doubts were already clear. She lowered her head, her hands trembling. David saw it and knew he was winning. "Think about it," he said, standing up. "You have until tomorrow. If you accept my offer, we both get what we want." That night, Melanie couldn't sleep. Her thoughts swung between fear and despair. She remembered moments when Brian had been there for her, when he'd helped her despite her betrayal. But could she trust him after everything? And could she risk her life for him? The morning brought a new level of tension. Brian prepared for the meeting with David, not knowing what Melanie had decided. She stayed silent, avoiding his gaze. When he asked if everything was okay, she only nodded. When they arrived at the meeting place, David was already waiting. His confidence was unshaken. He glanced at Melanie and asked, "So, have you made your choice?" Melanie sighed, her voice calm. "Yes, I have." She reached into her bag, pulled out a flash drive, and placed it on the table in front of David. "Here's everything you wanted." Brian froze. His heart sank as he realized what she had done. "Melanie, how could you?" "I couldn't take the risk," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "Forgive me." David picked up the flash drive and laughed. "You made the right choice." But at that moment, the doors suddenly burst open, and men in uniform entered the room. Police. They quickly confiscated the flash drive and apprehended David. "What is this?" he shouted, trying to escape. Melanie looked at Brian. "It was the only way," she said. "I knew he wouldn't trust me, so I gave the real evidence to the police." Could Melanie really have changed? Or was this just another chapter in her endless game?